Thank you so much. Good evening again, and it's a great pleasure that you're here with us on behalf of Wipro, on behalf of the Azim Premji University. I welcome you, and we together welcome our guests David and Elaine Orr, and this welcome must be really intense, because if the two of them have come down, I think, I guess 8,000 miles or 10,000 miles, right? It's a really long way, So thank you so much. Thanks for being here with us. And, it's, the reason I said it's got to be doubly intense is because, they've really taken trouble to come here. There was some minor problem with their visa, and therefore they had to actually fly down to New York over the weekend. They spent 2 days there, unscheduled flights, and they just landed early in the morning, and they're right here with us. So thank you doubly. Thank you so much. Okay. Every one of us here who's present in this room, David does not need any introduction, right? So I'm not going to introduce David to you. I'm just going to suggest to you as to, why Wipro thought, why the Azim Premji University thinks this is an important issue, and why we are so glad that David is here to talk to us. In our view, concern for environment, for ecology, what's happening, whether it's at a global level, climate change, or at a local level, the issue of groundwater, these are perhaps the things that will define the shape of humanity over the next 30, 40, 50 years. Right? So that's what we think. That's perhaps a lot of us share that understanding and belief. The thing is that while we believe this, the question that hits us all the time is that what do we do about it? And of course, there's no one thing that one can do about it, but there are many things that one has to do. One of those things, and I think that is something that we are deeply invested into, is that can we, and when I say we, I'm not meaning Wipro or the Azim Premji Foundation, but we are meaning we as a nation, can we reconfigure, realign our education system, our school education system such that it so deeply integrates the issues of environment and ecology that we really make some genuine and serious attempt at a societal level to really factor in the future, the environment and ecology, right? So that's sort of a thing that we've been working on. As a part of that, last year, Wipro launched the Earthian event. And Earthian is basically a program where schools and colleges engage on issues of environment, right? The intention is to perhaps do a lot many more things. And as we've been thinking about it, we thought about people who are across the world who've contributed enormously, absolutely enormously, to the thinking around this issue. And many more issues. And, of course, one of the first names that we had was David. And, through a mutual friend, we sort of invited David. And to our incredible surprise, we didn't expect that, we would have really the good fortune of having you here with us. But he agreed to come over. So thank you so much. And from here on, David for you. And David will speak for about 45, 50 minutes. And I think then we'll have a brief question and answer session. Is that right? Thank you so much. David Orr.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. It is nice to be here. We started 4 days ago. Started walking 4 days ago. It's a long way to Bangalore. What I would like to do is to split this talk into two parts and begin by talking about first development, what it means, and sustainable development. And I'd like to then phase into education, because I think that education has something to do with the creation of a very different model of sustainability that would be made visible and powerful in the way we teach and so forth. On the screen behind me is an image of a black swan. And it comes, there's a movie also by the name of Black Swan, but I'm referring to a book by a Lebanese financial risk analyst by the name of Nassim Taleb. And the point of the book is that all swans are white until one's black. It's an unpredictable event. And so the financial collapse of 2008 or that of 1929, doesn't matter, largely unpredictable as we see the world. And now we live in a black swan world where unpredictable events with global consequences, mostly irreversible as we would measure the time, are part of the future. Let me begin with development. The word overshoot comes from the science of ecology, and it's applied to animals that simply overexploit their resource base. And we're not much different as humans on the planet. And if you think about population growth, in the year 1800, there were roughly, give or take, 1 billion humans on Earth. Now we're at 7.1. The UN median prediction is that humans on the planet will grow to around 10 billion and then begin a leveling off. We hope it's not a catastrophic collapse, but we're in some kind of overshoot. By one estimate, also on the screen, humans now take about half of what is called the net primary productivity of the whole planet. And that simply means sunshine falling on the earth in photosynthesis, generating natural wealth, and it's eaten by plants and so forth, or eaten by other animals. And so that is the driver of the global ecosystem. We now take half of that. We pave it over for parking lots or roads. We direct a good bit of that into the human estate. Our ecological footprint, the total footprint of humans on the earth is probably 20% greater than the planet can support right now. If everybody were to live as Americans do, my country, we'd need, it is said, 3 or 4 more Earths to support that population consumption. Looking ahead, we see biodiversity losses of maybe a quarter. Some people estimate as much as 1/2 of the plants and animals on Earth with us now will disappear sometime in this century. And the fact is, we don't know. No one knows with any great certainty how many plants and animals are on the Earth, but we do know that they're in jeopardy. It isn't global warming. The last item on this screen is it is global destabilization. And we have created what some people are calling now a different planet. American writer Bill McKibben refers to this as Earth, spelled E-A-A-R-T-H, a different world. Now, I want to make a point, and I want to get off it quickly. This is this model of development that has driven this and is now driving the entire world. It broke out first in England, a bit like a virus. And the early English mills that fueled that first round of industrialization on the planet back in the 18th century, spilling into the 19th century, were fueled very much by wealth taken from India, deforestation in India, and the profits from the East India Company and so forth were invested in those mills in Lancaster and Birmingham. That's what started the development process. And so at the very outset, there was exploitation. It so happened to be it was the country of India, your country. As development went on, and I want you to pay attention to the third item here. This is from a report done by published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. And the third item here is that most of the development costs of what we take to be the first world have been borne by the third world. So development as we did it was like a boat going through the water pushing a bow wave of debt in front of it. Am I clear? So that development, the model that we created, was inherently unfair at the very outset. But it was also, for those of us in the developed world, paradoxical in all kinds of ways. As our knowledge went up, it's been noted quite often, our purposes went down. We had less and less thought about what we were doing. There was a kind of blind mechanism in the whole process. As the control of nature went up, the sustainability of the world went down. And there's no one in this room anywhere that knows enough that could predict a happy outcome. If this was a film or a movie, there's no happy outcome based on what we now know. Our current directions are not sustainable. As wealth went up for some, poverty also went up, and ironically, happiness went down. It's said that in the United States that happiness peaked, if you could measure this, that happiness in the United States peaked in 1957. For me, it was a little bit later, but we became, this is one of those moments that in the States you slap your forehead and you go, duh. It was one of those things that we equated happiness with stuff. And we all know in our bones that happiness isn't the product of stuff. It's relationships. And beyond some fairly minimal level of wealth, happiness doesn't rise. And then the fourth item on the screen, as military might went up, and the United States now spends about half of the money in the whole world that's spent on defense. We spend half of it. But security in the United States, the feeling of being secure has gone down. This is the age of paradox. We find out that security isn't related, and Gandhi said this a long time ago, to the weapons that we have. That tends to make us cowards. It is to a very different kind of spiritual understanding of our relationship with the world. And then as our communication systems we now email and we blog and we telephone and we have access to all kinds of communication devices that were not even a dream 20 years ago. The content, it seems to me, has dropped. We live in the age of paradox. So I want to say two things at the start. One is that this model of development that we created, and it was a Western model. It began first in England and Adam Smith and so forth, and the belief that we could grow our way into greatness. And then like a virus, it spread to the United States, and eventually went in Japan, and now it's in India and China. It's all over the world. The model began with exploitation. And I don't want to take that off the table. I want that to stay there, because now the exploited will be not only the poor of our time, but future generations. And so the model requires, again, pushing this bow wave of debt off into the future in ways that we don't calculate and we do not pay for. And then secondly, the model was at the very outset paradoxical. It didn't give us what we thought it would give us. Now, let me make this, I'm still on the issue of sustainability, and let me make a distinction between things that happen quickly, the headlines of the paper, the things that attract our attention right away, the fast variables, financial crises and nutty celebrities and bizarre things that happen, and that's what's on the front page, at least, of our papers in the United States and in Europe. And then there are slow things that really count. And sustainability is about the things mostly at the bottom of this, and they happen generally slowly. They affect carbon cycles and the nitrogen cycle, but the carbon cycle isn't on the front page of the India Times very often, I'll bet. It sure is not on the front page of the New York Times. There is soil loss, We were just talking outside here about groundwater loss. That's a slow process. We don't much see that. But it's slow. It's like soil erosion. It's just kind of a disappearing. And then as humans, there is this phenomenon called shifting baselines. You and I get used to things as they begin to move down. We accept the normal conditions at which we're born, and we are not aware of what used to be. And then there are social trends, literacy and poverty and debt and food and population and energy ratios. All these things happen very slow, and those variables are the driver in sustainability. And then there are these things. Population growth, I mentioned. There is underway around the world an energy transition that is occurring faster than some thought it might, to wind and to solar and efficiency and so forth, but slower than it should. There are environmental stresses that are growing, land and water and oceans, and rapid climate destabilizations, and then political instabilities. And I think what we'll find in future decades is conflict, and pressures toward conflict will rise as water becomes more scarce, as resources become more scarce, and all this points to a very different model of development that we're struggling to achieve. And then, as Nassim Taleb points out, there's simply the connectivity of the system. What happens in Bangalore affects things in South Asia, that affects the global markets, that eventually affects my little hometown, you'll see in a moment, of Oberlin, Ohio. And so we live in a world that is highly connective and rapidly so. And the connections are, as Taleb describes, often permanent, mostly global, and they're sometimes unpredictable. And then there's the capacity of small groups and individuals to disrupt. Terrorism now is a major factor here and in the States and in Europe and elsewhere. And so anybody that decides to become a terrorist can cause massive disruption around the world. The upshot is kind of this. This is what's called a Gaussian curve, named after the mathematician that first created it. Most of our attention is given to the high part of this curve. That's what has gotten our attention. And the point of Nassim Taleb's book is that, in fact, it's this, what he calls the long tail. It's improbable events, or events of unknown probability, that drive the world. So, black swan events. Yasi was the largest cyclonic event to hit Australia in February of 2011. This is the tidal wave created by the Fukushima disaster. This is a black swan event that involved the convergence of a seismic event in the 9+ Richter range, some really bad planning in Japan, faulty equipment made in the United States, and a bit of corruption, and the rest is well known. It was a disaster at a scale we have yet to fully comprehend. This is an oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico off the shore of the United States. This is the British Petroleum Horizon drilling rig. This was thought to be the safest rig ever to operate until it wasn't. Black swan event. This is a bridge that crossed the Mississippi River in Minneapolis. It was inspected about a month before it collapsed. It was said to be safe. Black swan event. Safe bridge until it wasn't. And black swan events aren't only technological or mechanical systems. They also have to do with other variables. This is the Food and Agricultural Organization, the UN agency, charting of food prices, and you'll notice that the real price here in yellow is going up just before the outbreak of the Arab Spring, and this is a picture taken in Cairo. And so black swan events can be all those factors that affect food prices, that then affect political instability, that then ripple out through the whole Middle Eastern region and elsewhere. And the long story short, black swan events are being driven by two different kinds of deficits. Financial deficits are the obvious thing. That's what captures our attention. and sooner or later we'll figure out how to balance the financial books, or they'll do it themselves. The other deficits are those slow variables that are like the food crisis and soil erosion and the carbon cycle, and those we have yet to figure out. And the challenge of sustainability, it seems to me, is to begin to develop models of advancement that reconcile these two kinds of deficits, one being financial and one being equity and so forth, and the other being basically what we owe to the natural world. How do we balance the carbon cycle? And if we don't do it, it will simply balance on its own. This slide, I don't like to put a lot of print on the screen, but regarding financial deficits, and I want to make a point here, the economic model that we have that created the models of development that have affected everyone here, for better or for worse, those models began with the writing of Adam Smith's book, a Scotsman, writing a book called The Wealth of Nations. And it became the model or the template for economic thinking. And the problem it seems to me we have in a little bit different way is to reconcile the laws of economics that we take, the laws of the market that we take to be so firm, with the laws of the planet that go back 3.8 billion years. So here we have a model of thinking that affected the way we see the world and the way we've developed that is maybe 234 or 235 years old, reconciling that with the way the Earth works as a physical system that's evolved over 3.8 billion years. And then it gets worse. This is what's called the Keeling curve. And this is, it's named after an American scientist by the name of David Keeling. And David Keeling went to Mauna Loa in 1958 and began to track carbon in the atmosphere. And in 1958, carbon that he found in the atmosphere was about 315 parts per million. So the CO2 composition of the atmosphere was about 315 parts per million. If you take the curve back this way in time, we can now extend it back with a very firm scientific record that goes back about 640,000 years in the ice core record. We know that carbon didn't go, or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere did not go much above 280 parts per million. If you weaken the standards of evidence a bit and use inferential data, you can actually take it back several million years. And in fact, over several million years, the rate of carbon was fairly constant in the atmosphere. And so we've driven now carbon up into a very different kind of level. The zigzag in the line here is simply the breathing in and out of carbon. So in the fall in the northern hemisphere, when the leaves fall, carbon's released to the atmosphere. In the spring, it's pulled back out of the atmosphere, and that gives this kind of sawtoothed edge. We're now at the level of about 393 parts per million CO2. 2 months ago, scientists discovered a level above the Arctic Ocean of 400 parts per million. Now, one of the difficulties we've had in the States, we're locked into a pattern of climate denial. One of the problems we've had is that there is a roughly 30-year lag between the time carbon exits our tailpipes of our cars and smokestacks of our factories and the time we see the weather changes that are driven by climatic changes. And so what we're now seeing in climate anomalies is this first and lower arrow. So we're seeing now lots of anomalies, and I'll show you a slide of that in just a moment. But we don't have a clue, we don't know yet, what 390 plus levels of CO2 will do to weather patterns here or around the world. But what this means is that we're entering a brand new world. It's been called the Anthropocene. which just simply means we've come out of what geologists call the era of the Holocene, the last 10 or 12,000 years, in which we became everything that humans became. That was the era in which we formed our languages and our culture and our religion. That was our wars, our history, our poetry. Everything about humans was in that 10 to 11,000 year period. We're now out of that. We're in a brand new era. 2 degrees centigrade. When we did a few years ago, a group of us did a climate action plan for the next U.S. president, which turned out to be Barack Obama. But we brought together a group of scientists from around the country and some involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we asked, where is the point of no return? Where is the point beyond which we should not go? And every one of them said 2 degrees centigrade warming. Now, that doesn't mean that 1.5 or our present level of 8.9 degrees of warming is safe. All it means is that at 2 degrees, all bets are off. And it may very well be that 1 degree or 1.5 degrees would pose mortal threats to civilization. But every one of them said the same thing, that at 2 degrees warming, all bets are off. We are now, according to a number of studies, including the International Energy Agency, the Royal Academy of Sciences, the U.S. Academy of Sciences, and any number of other reports, we are now headed for 2 degrees centigrade warming or beyond, unless we take emergency action. And the question, of course, for sustainable development is who would do what? But this reveals one more thing about sustainable development. It's got to be carbon free. And it's got to be very quick. And it's got to be fair. It's got to be equitable and so forth. In terms of climate change, what this does for the analysis of Nassim Taleb, it simply shifts that Gaussian curve rightward. It means that we have moved probabilities, or if I change the metaphor, we've loaded the dice now so that the dice now has 2 or 3 faces that come up catastrophe instead of maybe just one. In terms of natural catastrophes worldwide, this is data from Swiss Re, the reinsurance, the world's largest reinsurance company. It shows that catastrophes are rising. This is a graphic from that environmental rag Forbes magazine in the United States. That's a joke. That's a very pro-business magazine in the United States. This is simply the upward trending of natural disasters as they charted it 5 years ago. It's continued to rise. This is, and you can find all kinds of maps that show roughly the same thing. This is, and in color, this looks about right. This is dryness, and we were talking about this just a few moments ago. Your monsoon isn't performing, I guess, as it ought to perform. But what this is a UN slide. What this shows is whatever your weather has been, you're going to get more of it. So if typically you're in a dry area, it will likely get drier. If you're in a wet area, it's likely going to get wetter. These are projections. But what we don't know is how, as we trend upward from 390 parts per million to 400 to 450, how this will affect this system. We're running a vast experiment on planet Earth that should not, as somebody noted a long time ago, should not ever be run. This is the Russian summer of 2010. This is where that summer fits on that Gaussian curve. Highly black swan event. Not easily predictable, probably catastrophic. This has affected grain prices. It still is affecting grain prices to a shrinking degree. But in the year 2012, we're still seeing the effect of that particular crisis on world grain markets. We're about to see the same thing because of drought in the United States on world food prices also. And then ahead, there is lots more black swan events. The United Nations projects something like 250 million or more climate refugees by mid-century. We'll see more political, economic, and social instability, and then we'll see the ripple effects because this is going to affect lots of other kinds of things. Taleb concludes his book by saying that Mother Nature likes redundancies, but nothing too big. Mother Nature would never create an American company called Walmart. Too big. It would never create an Exxon Mobil. Too big. It doesn't like connections, too much connectedness. And so what it likes is redundancies. And that's an argument for diversity. I'll come back to that in another talk later next week. But it likes diversity, and it likes to have fire breaks or fire walls between various kinds of things. And the upshot, in Taleb's words, is a society, a sustainable society that would be robust to error. And that is with those fire breaks between various kinds of systems, so that whatever happens in, let's say, New York City doesn't necessarily adversely affect Bangalore, and vice versa. A world that has some redundancy to it. Now that takes me to the second part of my talk. This is my little town. Elaine and I are from a little city in Ohio called Oberlin. It was named after a German preacher by the name of John Frederick Oberlin. It was founded in 1832, so we're a newcomer as the history of towns is measured. I said last year to an audience, somebody wanted to know how I got pictures like this. And I said, well, you attach a first-year college student to a helium-filled balloon, and you give them a camera with electronic download. And I said that this particular student who took this picture had not transferred from the college, but kind of drifted away. And they thought I was serious. I'm not. This was actually taken by a camera on a balloon, no student attached. But this is a very typical Ohio downtown. 3 years ago, the college where I teach at Oberlin College launched a project called the Oberlin Project. And I want to describe that very briefly. It grew out of this building. This building is called the Adam Joseph Lewis Center. We built this building in the late 1990s as an educational project. Now, the upshot about sustainability for me is this. No one really knows what that word means. That's a complicated word. It means extending human longevity and hopefully doing it in a way that's fair and decent and durable and powered by sunshine. But beyond those generalities, nobody really knows much about what that word means. And I take that to be an educational project. You and I as humans learn best, it seems to me, by things that we can see and touch and feel and experience. And so we set out in this project, this had been a parking lot. We set out in this project to make a building that was the architectural embodiment of sustainability as best we could understand it, and do that as an educational venture. And so we opened the, do I need to start drinking? Thank you. We began that as an educational project. We said, if you want to be part of designing a building, that we want to model sustainability, come on in. So we had about 13 public design meetings. And we had about 250 students and townspeople come into the process. And the standard for the building was we wanted it powered by sunshine, no fossil fuels. The standard for water in the building was drinking water comes into the building, drinking water leaves the building, no waste. We wanted the building made out of materials that were sustainable. So every bit of the production process had to be thought of as sustainable. We wanted to eliminate toxics. The average young person in the United States carries a body burden of about 230 or so organochlorine compounds in their body tissues. It's been in their drinking water, it's in their food, it's in the water they bathe in, it's in the air they breathe. And so at the point of birth, they arrive, in the words of one study, pre-polluted. So we decided that we would eliminate all the chemicals that are typically used in the thousands of products that go into a building. So we wanted to make this building as educational as we could and a model of sustainability in the belief that we mostly understand well things that we can see and touch and feel and experience. Then add one more thing to that, things that we actually participate in doing. And so the students came together, and the standard for this building became that we wanted to design so well and so artfully as to cause no ugliness, human or ecological, somewhere else or at some later time. Do you understand that? Now, if that's the standard, then you have to go upstream from that thing called a building. You have to go to the wells and the mines and the manufacturing places and the forests and so forth where material flow starts. And if there's ugliness, human or ecological, you can't say that that building is sustainable. And the same thing downstream from the building. If you've toxified the environment, contributed planetary heating, if you've driven species to extinction, you can't say that the building is sustainable or beautiful. Now, that's a tough standard. Like truth and beauty and justice, that's one we have to strive to meet. We'll never quite get there. But that is the standard for sustainability. Now, what we did in this was to take this is an 1.25 acre site. 1 hectare is about 2.25 acres, so this is well less than a hectare. So we took that little 1.25 acre site and we made it a laboratory for sustainability. How can you make sustainability visible in that little spot and make it work? Power it by sunshine, zero discharge, no waste product, no toxic materials, and then make it also educational. Because that is just a building, and the change has to be here. So all of you who are educators and students, the real change, the function of the building, buildings are just buildings, but the real function of that building was to change how people thought and to create a curriculum and applied hope. If there's one thing missing, it is the hope that we can create a better world. So it had to be downsized to something that people could get their heads around and get their hands on. This is another view of the same building. The building was named by an American Institute of Architecture panel 2 years ago as the most important green building of the past 30 years. This is the back of the building, and you're seeing at the back an orchard, there's a garden. The landscape is maintained by students, so they're involved in the making and the development of the building. This is an interior shot. One of the things that grew out of the building was a monitoring system that monitors. There are about 160 data sensors in this building. And we began this as a class. And so students worked with a group from one of the U.S. federal laboratories, the National Renewable Energy Lab. And the question was, what do you want the building to say to you, and how do you report that? And so we wired the building. At that time, you could do it wireless now, but we wired the building with 160 data sensors. So we collect data 24/7, all day, every minute of the day, about energy use, indoor air quality, and all kinds of other things. The students that did this claim that they can even monitor the brain waves of faculty whose offices are in the building. But what do they know? This exercise grew into a high-tech company called Lucid Designs. And they're now probably the best U.S. high-performance building monitoring company. This was 3 former students that were in that class. And we're now doing the same kind of thing in a project I'll show you in just a second. we've now launched the Oberlin Project. And what we're aiming to do is to, first of all, take the downtown of this small city and make it as sustainable as we possibly can. So we're starting with a downtown block of about 13 acres and rendering that block powered by sunshine, zero discharge, the same standards we did on that little, the Lewis Center that you just saw. We're one of 14 cities worldwide selected as climate positive by Bill Clinton's climate initiative. We've now been rolled into the C40 cities. Obviously, at 10,000 people, we're the small city on the block. The others are big cities, including one in India and 2 in China. Our third goal is to restructure a food system, a local food system around the city in a green belt of about 20,000 acres that might eventually supply up to 70% of the food consumed locally. Our fourth goal is to now use the entire city as a classroom. So for sustainable development, taking the ideas that we had in that building and now extending that to roughly an 8-mile radius around us. And we've done that. We want to work at a larger scale and take on cities the size of Los Angeles or even parts of New York. And then we're aiming to replicate this elsewhere in a network. We have 2 national offices, and so we're aiming to replicate this model elsewhere in the country. What we've done locally is to organize the community into, there's 7 teams represented on the screen. There are actually 11. But we've got about 300 people locally that are involved in one or more of these teams around education, economic development, and energy, and so forth. So we pulled the community together into a much wider dialogue in the belief that sustainability isn't just something that has to happen in a classroom. It now has to be out on the street. You've now got to take sustainability out so that everybody understands it, and the economy is reshaped around sustainability. The point here is to get sustainability away from people like you and me that are in education or in corporate systems, and so get it out on the street so it becomes the default setting. It takes no more effort and no more thought than it takes for you and me to breathe or for our hearts to beat. These are pictures of some of the downtown development in the central development block. We happen to have in Oberlin a great art museum, a great conservatory of music, a great performing arts center, and an awfully lousy hotel, a bad hotel. And so this is the plan. This, as it turns out, is going to be the driver for a good bit of the Oberlin Project. This is a new hotel. Our standards on this particular building would be to power it all by sunshine, again, to make it zero discharge, drinking water in, drinking water out, no toxic materials. A couple of side views of it, a building across the street from it. Part of the solar development, we're now this summer deploying a second large solar array that would be about a 3 megawatt solar array. By comparison, our baseload power in Oberlin is around 11 megawatts, so this shaves a big part of our summer peak off. We're developing 35 farms locally to begin to localize our food system. This is simply a chart of things happening in the downtown that some have already happened, some yet to happen, which are depicted in red. These are the things that we've done to date. We formed a partnership with the city. We're one of not 16 but 14 Clinton climate positive cities. Next year our electric system will be 95% actually carbon free. So we've done a number of things depicted on this slide. And again, the idea is to begin to use the entire region as a school for sustainability, to use education and redevelopment and put these two together onto the same agenda. Let me close with some thoughts and then open to questions. Jared Diamond, a U.S. anthropologist and biologist and a considerable writer, wrote a book a few years back simply called Collapse. And sustainability is the other side of this. It's about how we create the dynamics of societies that do not collapse. But his point in the book is that societies collapse when they fail to anticipate a problem because they reason by false analogies. How clear we are about what we're doing is awfully important. When they fail to see problems that have arrived, slow trends, all those slow variables, soil loss, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They collapse when they fail to solve problems that were evident. And think of the tragedy of the commons or groupthink or denial. We don't always solve problems that we see. And they went on and he said, societies sometimes collapse when they don't solve problems that are simply beyond their capacity to solve them. What Canadian writer Thomas Homer Dixon refers to as an ingenuity gap, simply beyond our wherewithal, or overwhelmed by complexity. And the issue of climate change and sustainability, it isn't one issue. It's the coming together of dozens of issues, for me the most important of which will be equity on one side and climate change on the other. And those are intertwined in lots and lots of ways. And then the ratio of creative energy to maintenance. Joseph Tainter, an anthropologist of some note, wrote a book years ago describing collapse occurring when at some point of development more and more of the creative energy simply goes into maintaining what is instead of solving problems that are coming. And then finally, the last item here was when elites get isolated, which I think is particularly the case of the United States at this point. A couple of final thoughts. The biggest challenge, it seems to me, for both education and those of us concerned about sustainability, which ought to be everybody, is how to make a transition from a fossil fuel-powered world to one powered entirely by renewable energy, sunshine in its current forms, not its ancient form as coal or oil. And two last thoughts. The issue of sustainability appears to be, in a lot of ways, very complicated, but in most ways, it's really very simple. There was a wonderful book written in the States by a writer by the name of Robert Fulghum, and he described, in the title of the book gives away the point of the book, that all he ever needed to learn, he actually learned a long time ago in kindergarten. And kindergarten is actually a German institution that was transported to the United States. It's where you put your children at ages 4 and 5. And they learn kind of the basics. And they learn things like how to play fair. And there's a rule for sustainability. How to clean up their own messes. And that's about sustainability. And how to share their cookies. And how not to take things that aren't theirs. And how when danger's around, you hold hands crossing the street. And then when you hurt somebody, you say you're sorry. All those things you learned in kindergarten. And I think that's a pretty good way to think about sustainability. It's all those things that we as humans learned way, way back. Whatever the culture, whatever the country, we learn these things at our mother's knee. And to be a little more complicated about this, and to conclude, one of my favorite people in my life was a man who died a few years ago by the name of Thomas Berry. And Thomas Berry was a religious thinker and philosopher of some note. He wrote a book toward the end of his life called The Great Work. And every generation has its great work. Mostly it's not asked for. It's a war thrust upon it or a crisis of some sort. But the great work of our generation, yours and mine, everybody on the planet, is now pretty clear. And it goes like this. The first part is we've got to stabilize and then reduce greenhouse gases. This is climate change. And if we let this go too far, the evidence is very clear, civilization will be impossible at some point. Is it 1.5 degrees of warming, or is it 2 degrees, or is it 4 degrees? No one knows for sure, but we're headed in that direction until we reverse it. So the first thing is to stabilize greenhouse gases. If you turn that coin over, the second part of this is good news. Could you power the civilization that we built around the Earth by current sunshine? The answer is overwhelmingly yes, we could. Sunshine in all of its forms, photovoltaic energy, wind power, microturbines, plus efficiency. In the United States, we probably waste at least half of the amount of energy that we consume at a very considerable cost. And we have good reason to support that. To eliminate waste and power civilization by sunshine, we can do that. And then there's third. There needs to be some kind of global bargain. And it's been described in some cases as contraction of overdeveloped economies, the United States in particular, and then convergence on a goal of development that works for everybody around the Earth. In our case, it means going from about 22 tons of carbon dioxide emitted per person per year down to 2. So somehow we need a global bargain. And without that bargain, there will be no future for humankind. And it can happen by happenstance. It can happen just because we move in that direction. But my hunch is it's going to take an agreement. And so far the Kyoto process hasn't worked. We're part of the culprit. We're a big part of the reason why it hasn't worked. And then there's a very different paradigm. I think Adam Smith had it wrong, because what he didn't include was all the other things that economists refer to that we discount as externalities. And so that bow wave of debt I mentioned at the very beginning, that wasn't factored in. The bow wave of debt that spills onto future generations, that wasn't factored in. We need a whole different way to think about humans in the natural world. And what windmills and solar collectors do is if we deploy them in time, they buy us some time. But that's all they do. And what we have to do is to figure out as humans, the 7.1 billion of us on the planet and the next couple billion on the way, what we do with that time. Because the issues that bedevil us are issues that affect you and the person beside you. They're issues between nationalities and ethnic groups and orientation in countries. They're issues that are human, and that's what we have to solve. But we have to buy ourselves some time to solve them. It seems to me we need a different model of sustainability. I began by talking about sustainability, and no one knows exactly what that will require of us. My sense is that it will look very different in Bangalore than it does in Oberlin, Ohio, and very different in London than it does, say, in Tokyo. There isn't one size that fits all. We know some things. It's got to be powered by efficiency and sunlight, but beyond that, it will vary a great deal. What we're doing in Oberlin fits our situation. What you will do here will fit your situation. There'll be some commonalities. One of the commonalities, I think, is that we'll learn to discover a model of prosperity that does not include the growth of stuff. And there has been a good bit of thinking about that, to begin to keep the throughput of stuff from the mines and the wells and the forests and farms at a constant level that can be replaced without having to continually grow. And so no one should sell off their forest or be forced to sell off their forest or their mineral wealth so the growth can occur someplace else. We need a model of sustainability that prosperity occurs without growth. And then finally, my background is in politics. I think we need a very different political model so that the people who conduct the public business do the public business not as an avenue to private wealth, but as a trust for future generations. So sustainability, I've covered a lot of ground, and sustainability basically includes about everything you could possibly think of. Is it philosophy? Absolutely. Is it religion? Surely. Is it economics? Absolutely. Is it development? Is it building? Is it medicine? Is it healthcare? It's all of those things. It's the whole human enterprise. And I think if we understood more clearly what it entailed, it would help us to act more confidently in the realization of a very different model. And this means, as I've tried to say, a very different model of education as well. And I'll come back to that in a talk tomorrow. Thank you all.